Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going back in time, back to 2012.
Ooh, time travel.
In a way, we're going to be looking at indigenous communities around the world through the lens of the IWGIA's report, the Indigenous World 2012. This report, it's a treasure trove of information on indigenous rights covering a whopping 61 countries and 12 international processes.
Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And it's fascinating to see the common threads, the shared struggles, and the incredible resilience of these communities even back then. So are you ready to take a deep dive into the world of indigenous rights?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Okay, so the report kicks off with this global overview, and one thing that really jumps out, even from the get-go, is the impact of extractive industries on indigenous communities.
Extractive industries, you mean like mining, logging, oil extraction?
Exactly. These industries often operate on indigenous lands, displacing communities, disrupting their traditional ways of life, and causing significant environmental damage.
Right, it's like this constant tension between economic development and the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands and resources.
And the report doesn't shy away from giving some pretty stark examples.
Yeah.
For instance, the Conga mining project in Peru.
Oh yeah, that was a big one.
It had the potential to contaminate water sources for over 100,000 people.
It's a classic example of how the pursuit of profit often comes at the expense of the environment and the well-being of indigenous communities.
Absolutely. And it raises these really important questions about sustainability, about justice, about whose voices are being heard, and whose needs are being met in these development decisions.
It's like who gets to define progress and at what cost?
Right. And it's not just happening in Peru. The report points to over 1,100 violent conflicts over indigenous lands in Malaysia, just between 2005 and 2010. And a similar trend was happening in Indonesia, too.
Wow, that's a staggering number. And despite efforts to develop more progressive legal frameworks in these countries, it seems like there's still a huge disconnect between what's on paper and what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. Laws and policies are important, of course, but without proper implementation, enforcement, and accountability mechanisms, they're just empty promises.
Empty promises and a lot of frustration for the communities who are trying to assert their rights.
Definitely. Now, the report also dives into some significant legal victories, offering some hope amidst all these challenges.
Oh, tell me about those. We need some good news.
Well, one major win was in Ecuador, where an Ecuadorian court found Chevron Texaco guilty of environmental damage in the Amazon. This was a landmark case.
I remember that one. It was huge. It really captured global attention.
It did. It set a precedent, holding a multinational corporation accountable for its actions and giving hope to other indigenous communities fighting similar battles.
It's a reminder that even in the face of these powerful corporate interests, justice is possible.
Right. But as the report points out, the road to justice can be really long and arduous. The Sariaku community in Ecuador, for example, was still waiting for a verdict in their case against the government for oil exploitation on their land without their consent.
So they were fighting for their right to free, prior, and informed consent, the right to say yes or no to development projects on their lands.
Exactly. A fundamental right that's often ignored in the pursuit of profit.
Yeah. Sadly, it's a familiar story, not just in Ecuador, but in many parts of the world where indigenous communities are fighting for control over their lands and resources.
Okay, let's shift gears now and head north, way north to the Arctic. The report focuses on two contrasting cases, Greenland and Russia.
The Arctic, that's interesting. What's happening there?
Well, in Greenland, there was a push for independence, driven in part by their desire to control their own natural resources, especially after they gained more autonomy with their 2009 Act of Self-Government.
So they saw their resources as a pathway to self-determination.
Exactly. But then, on the other hand, you have Russia, where indigenous communities were actually losing access to their traditional fishing and hunting grounds because of new laws that favored commercial interests.
So it's like two sides of the same coin. In one case, resources are seen as a tool for empowerment, for self-determination, and in the other, they're a source of further marginalization and dispossession.
It's a reminder that the impact of resource development on indigenous communities can vary dramatically depending on the context, the legal frameworks in place, and the power dynamics at play.
And it highlights the need to move beyond these simplistic narratives that pit economics development against indigenous rights. It's not a zero-sum game. There are ways to achieve both, but it requires a fundamental shift in thinking and a commitment to justice and sustainability.
Okay, let's cross the Atlantic now and head over to Canada. The report gives us a glimpse into the 4 Inuit land claims regions and some interesting developments within them.
I'm curious, what did the report highlight in Canada?
Well, for example, in Nunavik, there was a proposal for a Nunavik government, but it was rejected in a referendum.
So a setback for self-governance in that region.
Yeah, but meanwhile, Nunavut was establishing its own legislative assembly, taking a step towards greater autonomy.
So even within a single country, you have these very different paths unfolding, different communities navigating their own unique challenges and opportunities.
And it's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to Indigenous rights.
Mm.
Each community has its own distinct history, its own aspirations, and its own way of engaging with these complex issues.
It's about recognizing that diversity and supporting communities in their self-determined paths.
Absolutely. The report also dives into the case of the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group in Canada, who were petitioning the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, seeking redress for their expropriated land.
Oh, wow. Taking their case to the international level.
It's a powerful example of how Indigenous communities are using international legal mechanisms to fight for their rights when domestic systems fail to provide justice.
It's like saying, we're not giving up. We're going to keep fighting for what's right, even if it means going beyond our own borders.
Now let's hop across the border and take a look at the United States. The report covers a range of issues, including the disproportionate representation of Native children in foster care. It's a really heartbreaking statistic.
I can imagine. That reflects the long-lasting impacts of historical assimilation policies and the ongoing struggles of Native communities to protect their children and cultural heritage.
It's a reminder of the deep wounds inflicted by colonialism and the need for healing and reconciliation.
And it underscores the importance of supporting Indigenous-led initiatives that address these issues and empower communities to care for their own children and preserve their cultural traditions.
The report also highlights the conflicts surrounding uranium mining near the Grand Canyon.
Ah, that's right. The Havasupai tribe was fighting to protect their sacred sites from potential contamination.
Exactly, and it's a perfect example of that clash between economic interests, environmental protection, and the preservation of cultural and spiritual heritage, which is something we see happening all over the world.
It's like, how do we balance these competing demands? How do we ensure that development doesn't come at the expense of the things that make life meaningful and sustainable?
It's a question we need to be grappling with, not just in the context of Indigenous rights, but in all our decisions about how we live on this planet.
Our next stop takes us to Mexico, where the report focuses on the challenges of Indigenous education. The statistics on access to education, especially for Indigenous migrant children, are quite concerning.
Really concerning. Only 20% of an estimated 400,000 Indigenous migrant children were within the education system, and even existing Indigenous education programs faced budget cuts.
That's a huge barrier to opportunity, to breaking cycles of poverty and marginalization. It's like if they're being denied their right to a future.
Right, and it's not just about access to education in general, but also about culturally relevant education that respects their languages, traditions, and ways of knowing.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring that education empowers Indigenous communities rather than assimilating them into a dominant culture that often devalues their knowledge and experiences.
The report also sheds light on the Nahoa community of Santa Maria Ostila, who are facing violence and even murder linked to development interests on their land.
Sadly, that speaks to the very real risks that Indigenous activists and communities face when they dare to defend their land and rights.
It's a reminder that the fight for Indigenous rights can be a dangerous one, and we need to stand in solidarity with those who are putting their lives on the line.
Okay, let's continue our journey south to Nicaragua. The report offers a mixed bag here, highlighting both positive steps and persistent challenges.
Mixed bag, how so?
Well, on the one hand, Nicaragua had ratified ILO Convention 169, which is the International Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. And they had also endorsed UNDRP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
So good steps on the international stage, at least.
Right. But then, on the other hand, the report also documents this continued practice of land grabbing and a lack of genuine consultation with Indigenous communities before development projects are implemented on their territories.
So it's like this disconnect between the commitments made on paper and the realities on the ground.
Exactly. And it's something we see again and again in different countries, highlighting the importance of moving beyond symbolic gestures and ensuring that these international agreements actually translate into concrete actions that protect Indigenous rights and empower them to participate in decision-making processes.
Now let's head to Costa Rica, where despite having designated indigenous territories, the rights laid out in their indigenous law weren't being fully respected.
I'm curious to hear about that. What kind of challenges were they facing?
Well, take the Kikoldi indigenous community, for example. The state actually undermined their land titles, leading to clashes with the authorities.
Wow, so it's not just corporations or private interests violating indigenous land rights, it's the state itself.
And to add insult to injury, there were continuous delays in enacting a law on consultation, which would have provided a framework for dialogue and participation in development projects affecting their lands.
It's like they're being denied their right to have a say in what happens to their own territories.
Exactly. It highlights that ongoing struggle for genuine recognition and respect for indigenous self-determination.
Our journey now takes us to Colombia, a country known for its incredible biodiversity and its rich cultural heritage.
Yeah, but the report also points out that they're facing a serious threat of language extinction, despite having constitutional recognition of indigenous rights and ratifying ILO 169.
It's a reminder that cultural diversity is precious and needs to be actively protected. It's not just about land and resources, it's about language, it's about spirituality, it's about those things that make a culture unique and vibrant.
Absolutely. And the report also notes the ongoing challenges with displacement and violence, especially linked to, you guessed it, expansion of plantations and resource extraction.
It seems like that's a recurring theme in many of the countries we've discussed so far. The allure of profit often trumps the rights and well-being of indigenous communities.
All right, let's turn our attention to Venezuela now. The report notes the government's announcement of a land handover to indigenous communities, which on the surface sounds positive.
Sounds promising, but I have a feeling there's more to the story.
You're right. Indigenous organizations raise concerns about the lack of consultation in restructuring the National Commission for Indigenous Land Demarcation, which is the body responsible for overseeing these land transfers.
Ah, so it's about who's in control, who's making the decisions. It's one thing to hand over land, but it's another to ensure that indigenous communities have a genuine say in how that land is managed and how their rights are protected.
It's about self-determination, isn't it? About recognizing indigenous communities as equal partners in these processes.
Absolutely. Okay, where to next?
Let's hop over to Suriname. Now, at the time of this report, it was the only country in the Western Hemisphere that didn't legally recognize indigenous rights.
Wow, that's surprising. So what was the situation there?
Well, despite this lack of legal recognition, the government had committed to addressing it, so there was some hope for positive change on the horizon.
It'll be interesting to see what progress they made after 2012.
Definitely. Now on to Peru. The report opens with some pretty stark statistics on poverty and lack of education among indigenous populations, which is a reflection of the systemic inequalities they face.
It's like they're trapped in this cycle of marginalization, denied access to the opportunities that would allow them to thrive.
And then the report goes right into the controversial Conga mining project, which we touched on earlier, with its potential to devastate water sources and ecosystems.
Ah, that's right. A classic case of profit over people and planet.
The report mentions protests and an internal report criticizing the project's environmental impact assessment. So clearly, there was some pushback even within the government itself.
That's encouraging. It shows that there are people within these institutions who are willing to speak up for what's right, to challenge the status quo, and to advocate for a more just and sustainable approach to development.
It's a reminder that change can come from within, but it often takes courage and persistence to make those voices heard. All right, where to next? I'm ready for another deep dive.
Let's head to Bolivia. The report details the Tipinayas conflict, which involved an indigenous march protesting a highway project that was planned to cut through their territory.
Oh, that's a powerful image. An
Yeah.
indigenous march standing up to protect their land and their way of life.
And it was a victory for them. The government initially tried to discredit the protesters, even crack down on the march with violence.
Wow, so they face real repression for speaking out.
They did. But ultimately, public pressure forced the government to suspend the project.
A reminder that collective action, when amplified by media attention and public support, can make a difference.
It's about raising awareness, about shifting public opinion, and about holding those in power accountable.
So inspiring. Okay, where are we headed now? Let's travel to Brazil, another country with a vast indigenous population and its own share of struggles. The report focuses on the Belo Monte Dam project and the Munduruku people's fight for their rights.
Ah, yes, the Belo Monte Dam, a massive infrastructure project with huge environmental and social impacts.
The Munduruku people were at the forefront of the resistance, raising concerns about the lack of consultation and the devastating effects of this project on their territories and their ecosystems.
It's another example of that pattern we've seen. Large-scale development projects being imposed on indigenous communities without their free, prior, and informed consent, often leading to displacement, environmental degradation, and cultural disruption.
And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to development, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of social, environmental, and economic well-being, and that prioritizes the rights and voices of those who are most affected.
It's about moving beyond this narrow definition of progress that prioritizes short-term economic gain over long-term sustainability and well-being of all.
From the Amazon rainforest, let's travel south to Paraguay. The report points out the lack of implementation of international rulings on indigenous rights, despite extreme poverty in many indigenous communities.
It's heartbreaking to see how these communities are being denied justice despite having international law on their side.
The report highlights cases of forced evictions and violence against indigenous communities, often perpetrated by non-indigenous settlers or private security forces.
It's a reminder that legal victories mean little without effective enforcement mechanisms and a genuine commitment to protecting the rights of indigenous peoples on the ground.
And it underscores the crucial role of human rights monitoring, documentation, and advocacy in holding states accountable to their obligations.
Absolutely. We need to keep shining a light on these injustices and demanding that governments take action to protect the rights and safety of indigenous communities.
Okay, let's continue south to Argentina. The report paints a similarly concerning picture, noting the continued disregard for both the national constitution and international treaties regarding indigenous rights.
It's like a broken record, isn't it? We see these legal frameworks in place, but they're not being implemented, they're not being enforced, and indigenous communities are left vulnerable to abuse and exploitation.
The report focuses on the Cola indigenous communities in Salta and their struggle for land rights, facing violence and a lack of government support.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often a local one, happening in communities, in villages, in remote corners of the world where the cameras aren't always watching.
And it's a reminder that we need to support these local struggles, to amplify their voices, and to hold those in power accountable.
So true. Where are we headed next?
Further south to Chile. The report shines a spotlight on the Mapuche people and their ongoing struggle for land rights and self-determination.
Ah, the Mapuche. Their struggle is so iconic, so inspiring.
And the report describes how their protests are often criminalized and anti-terrorism laws are used against them. Imagine that, being labeled a terrorist for defending your ancestral lands.
It's a tactic used to silence dissent, to delegitimize their movement, and to protect the interests of powerful economic actors.
And it highlights the importance of challenging those narratives, of standing in solidarity with indigenous communities, and of defending their right to peaceful protest.
Speaking of powerful economic actors, the report also talks about the situation in Australia, doesn't it?
It does. It opens with this shocking statistic: the life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.
I remember reading about that. It's a stark reminder of the ongoing legacy of colonialism and the systemic inequalities that continue to affect Indigenous peoples.
The report also mentions government consultations on constitutional recognition of Indigenous rights, which seemed like a positive step.
Hopefully, those consultations led to some meaningful change. It'll be interesting to see what happened after 2012.
It's always a work in progress, isn't it?
And it's important to remember that constitutional recognition is just one piece of the puzzle. It's about addressing the underlying systemic issues, the poverty, the discrimination, the lack of access to healthcare and education that contribute to those disparities in life expectancy.
The report briefly mentions the James Price Point Gas Project and the Kimberley Indigenous Communities Negotiated Agreement, which seemed like a potential model for more equitable resource development.
It's a reminder that collaboration is possible, that there are ways to find solutions that benefit both Indigenous communities and economic development.
It's about finding that balance, that respect for Indigenous rights and knowledge, and that willingness to engage in genuine dialogue and partnership.
All right, let's hop across the Tasman Sea now and head to New Zealand. The report touches on the Foreshore and Seabed Act controversy and the new Marine and Coastal Area Act, which attempted to address Maori concerns but still faced criticisms.
It's a complex issue, with historical grievances and competing claims to land and resources. The report leaves us wondering how those legal changes played out in the long run.
And it highlights the ongoing struggle for Maori to secure their customary rights and participate in the management of their coastal areas.
It's about recognition, isn't it? about acknowledging the historical injustices and finding ways to ensure that indigenous communities have a genuine say in the decisions that affect their lands, their resources, and their cultural heritage.
Now let's travel to the island of Guam, where the Chamorro people were discussing issues of self-determination and political status.
Guam, that's a U.S. territory, right?
That's right. So it raises these complex questions about sovereignty, about their relationship with the United States, and about their right to chart their own future.
And to make things even more complicated, there's this controversial U.S. military buildup on the island, which brought concerns about environmental and social impacts.
Another example of how militarization often disregards the rights and well-being of indigenous communities, displacing them from their lands, polluting their environments, and disrupting their cultural traditions.
From Guam, we fly to the small island nation of Tuvalu, where the government used emergency regulations to ban public meetings and protests after a community challenged a member of parliament.
Interesting. So it raises questions about freedom of assembly, about the limits of dissent, and about how traditional protocols and governance systems intersect with these modern concepts of democracy and human rights.
It's a reminder that indigenous communities often have their own ways of making decisions, resolving disputes, and of holding their leaders accountable, which may not always align with Western models of democracy.
And it's important to respect those different systems of knowledge and governance, to find ways to bridge those different worldviews, and to ensure that indigenous voices are heard and their rights are protected, even within their own cultural contexts.
All right, our next stop is Japan. The report describes the ongoing struggle of the Okinawan people against U.S. military bases.
Ah, yes. The Okinawans have been fighting for decades to have these bases removed from their island. They've borne a disproportionate burden of the U.S. military presence in the region, with their lands being confiscated, their environment polluted, and their communities disrupted by noise and military exercises.
The report focuses on the Futenmahanoko relocation plan, which was highly controversial.
And for good reason. It's often seen as just shifting the problem from one part of Okinawa to another, rather than addressing the root issue of the U.S. military presence itself.
And there were also concerns about the status of forces agreement, which can shield U.S. personnel from accountability for crimes committed in Japan.
That must be incredibly frustrating for the Okinawan people to feel like they have no recourse when justice is denied.
It highlights the power imbalances at play and the challenges of seeking accountability when dealing with foreign military forces.
Okay, where are we off to next?
Let's travel to China, where the report focuses on the situation of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang.
The Uyghurs have been facing a lot of repression in recent years.
The report describes the government's crackdown on religious freedom, the forced assimilation tactics, and the human rights abuses targeting the Uyghur community.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often intertwined with broader struggles for human rights, for freedom of religion and expression, for the right to maintain one's cultural identity in the face of oppression.
And it highlights the need for international solidarity and pressure to hold governments accountable for their actions and to protect the rights of all people, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, or cultural background.
Okay, on to Taiwan now. The report details a legal setback for the lowland Pingpu indigenous peoples in their fight for recognition.
It's interesting because Taiwan has made some progress in recognizing the rights of other indigenous groups, but the lowland Pingpu communities were still facing challenges in asserting their identity and securing their rights.
It highlights that even within countries that are making progress, there can be these disparities, these groups that get left behind.
The report also highlights the Yame people's protest against a nuclear waste dump planned for their island.
Another example of the environmental injustices that indigenous communities often face. It's like they're seen as disposable, their lands and their health sacrificed for the sake of progress or economic development.
It's a reminder that environmental justice is a crucial part of indigenous rights, that they have a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment, just like everyone else.
Now, where are we headed?
Let's travel south to the Philippines. The report mentions the slow progress in implementing their Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or IPRA.
That's a common challenge, isn't it? Having laws on paper is one thing, but making them a reality on the ground is another.
The report also describes the emerging trend of recognizing indigenous and community-conserved areas, or ICCAs.
Oh, that's a promising development. It's about recognizing the crucial role that indigenous communities play in protecting biodiversity and managing their traditional lands and resources.
And it's about moving beyond those top-down conservation models that often exclude indigenous peoples and impose solutions that don't respect their knowledge or their rights.
You're right. Onward to Indonesia now. The report focuses on the numerous land conflicts involving indigenous communities and palm oil companies.
Palm oil, that's a huge industry, but it's also been linked to widespread deforestation and human rights abuses.
The report details cases of violence and destruction as these companies encroach on indigenous lands, driven by the insatiable demand for palm oil.
It's another example of how globalization and economic development, when pursued without ethical considerations, can have devastating impacts on indigenous communities and their environments.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Between economic growth and environmental sustainability, between corporate profits and human rights.
Okay, from Indonesia, we hop over to neighboring Malaysia, where the report shines a light on the Penang people and their struggle against logging and plantation companies that are destroying their rainforest homelands.
The Penang are known for their deep connection to the rainforest, their traditional knowledge of the forest ecosystem, and their sustainable way of life.
The report describes their fight to protect their forests and the horrific issue of sexual violence against Penang women, often perpetrated by workers in these industries.
It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of profit often comes at a high human cost, especially for women and girls who are often the most vulnerable to exploitation and abuse.
Okay, let's travel north now to Thailand. The report focuses on the Karen indigenous people and their forced displacement due to the establishment of the Kangkachan National Park.
National parks, while important for conservation, can sometimes have unintended consequences for indigenous communities who have been living in those areas for generations.
Karen were resettled outside the park, but the report explains how those resettlement schemes often fail to provide sustainable livelihoods, leading many to return to their traditional lands, even if it means facing conflict or arrest.
It's a reminder that conservation needs to be approached in a way that respects the rights and livelihoods of indigenous communities and that involves them in decision-making processes.
It's about finding those win-win solutions that protect both biodiversity and the well-being of indigenous peoples.
Okay, on to Cambodia now. The report details the advocacy efforts around Prey Lang Forest, a vital resource for Khoi communities.
Prey Lang is a really interesting case because even though a protected area was established, the report points out concerns about a lack of community involvement, loopholes that allow for continued exploitation, and restrictions on indigenous people's access to resources.
So it's like the protected area is actually undermining the very communities it's supposed to be helping.
It's a reminder that conservation needs to be more than just drawing lines on a map and declaring an area protected. It needs to be about genuine partnerships with indigenous communities, recognizing their rights, their knowledge, and their role as stewards of the land.
Absolutely. Let's move on to Vietnam now. The report focuses on the lack of culturally appropriate sexual health programs for ethnic minority groups.
It's an important issue that often gets overlooked, but it's crucial to ensure that healthcare programs are designed in a way that respects cultural beliefs and practices, and that they are delivered in a way that is accessible and sensitive to the needs of indigenous communities.
Right. It's about more than just providing information. It's about building trust, addressing cultural sensitivities, and empowering communities to take control of their own health and well-being.
The report also contrasts the government's focus on preserving traditional songs and dances with the more pressing issues of poverty and land rights.
It's like saying, sure, we'll preserve your culture, but only the parts that we find aesthetically pleasing. We're not so interested in addressing the systemic inequalities that are driving you into poverty and dispossessing you from your lands.
It's a reminder that cultural preservation is important, but it shouldn't be used as a distraction from the more fundamental issues of justice and equality.
Okay, where to next?
Let's head to Laos. The report explains that while there's no official recognition of indigenous peoples there, there's significant ethnic diversity and a lot of the same issues we've been discussing.
The denial of indigenous identity is often a way to justify the denial of their rights. It's like saying, you don't exist, so you don't have any rights.
The report describes the negative impact of widespread land concessions on indigenous communities in Laos, including loss of agricultural land and sacred forests.
Another example of how globalization and economic development often prioritize profit over people and planet, leading to the dispossession of indigenous communities and the destruction of their environments.
Okay, let's move on to Burma, or Myanmar, as it's now officially known. The report paints a very bleak picture of the situation there under the military regime.
It was a time of intense repression, with widespread human rights abuses documented by organizations like Physicians for Human Rights and Human Rights Watch.
The report highlights the military's oppression of ethnic minorities, the forced labor, the violence, the displacement,
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often intertwined with broader struggles for democracy, for human rights, for peace.
and it highlights the responsibility of the international community to speak out against these atrocities, to hold the perpetrators accountable, and to support the people of Burma in their struggle for freedom and justice.
Now, where to next? We're nearing the end of this report, aren't we?
Yes, just a few more countries to go. Let's head to Bangladesh, where the government refuses to recognize indigenous people's rights and has even tried to remove the term indigenous from official documents.
It's like they're trying to erase their identity, to deny their existence.
The report highlights proposed legislative amendments that threatened indigenous land rights and the lack of progress on addressing land disputes in the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is often a legal one, involving navigating complex laws, advocating for policy changes, and challenging discriminatory practices in court.
Okay, on to Nepal now. The report describes the political struggles surrounding the recognition of indigenous people's rights and the implementation of identity-based federalism.
It's about representation, isn't it? About ensuring that indigenous communities have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives.
And it's about recognizing their right to self-determination, to govern themselves according to their own traditions and values.
All right, next stop, India. The report discusses the introduction of the Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation, and Resettlement Bill 2011.
That was a significant development, wasn't it? It sought to replace an outdated and controversial law that had been used to dispossess indigenous communities from their lands.
Right, and the report highlights the potential implications of this new bill for indigenous communities and the ongoing debate over its provisions and implementation.
It's a reminder that land rights are fundamental to indigenous peoples, and that any legislation related to land acquisition needs to prioritize their rights, their livelihoods, and their cultural survival.
Absolutely. And the report also highlights a really inspiring story. The Dongria Khan tribe's successful resistance against mining by Vedanta Resources.
Oh yes, the Nyongiri Hills case. That was a major victory, not just for the Dongria Khan people, but for indigenous communities all over the world.
It showed that even in the face of powerful multinational corporations, it's possible to resist, to mobilize, and to protect your land and your culture.
Okay, on to Sri Lanka now. The report points out the lack of specific development programs for the Vada people.
It's a common issue, unfortunately. Indigenous communities often get overlooked in mainstream development programs, their unique needs and circumstances ignored.
The report does highlight a positive development, though. The Memorandum of Understanding between the Vada and the Department of Wildlife Conservation.
Oh, tell me about that.
It offered a potential model for co-management of protected areas, recognizing indigenous knowledge, and allowing for their participation in managing their traditional lands and resources.
That's a great example of how conservation can be done right, in a way that benefits both biodiversity and indigenous communities.
And it's a reminder that indigenous peoples are not just beneficiaries of conservation. They are often the best stewards of the land, with generations of knowledge about how to manage it sustainably.
Okay, 2 more countries to go. Where to next?
Let's travel to Israel, where the report describes the plight of the Bedouin people facing government plans to forcibly relocate them and demolish their villages.
Another example of displacement and dispossession, driven by state policies that prioritize settlement expansion and control over land.
The report highlights the Bedouins' activism, their counterproposal for a recognition of their existing villages and land rights, and their determination to resist displacement.
It's a reminder that indigenous peoples are not passive victims. They are actively fighting for their rights, challenging discriminatory policies, and asserting their right to remain on their ancestral lands.
Okay, our final stop on this whirlwind tour of indigenous issues is Algeria.
Algeria, what's happening there?
Well, the report explains that the Amazigh people are still struggling for recognition as indigenous, even though their language and cultural identity have been recognized in the Constitution.
Ah, so it's about that disconnect between recognition on paper and genuine respect for their rights and self-determination in practice.
And the report describes the restrictions on freedom of assembly and the targeting of Amaze activists, highlighting the ongoing challenges they face in exercising their rights and advocating for change.
It's a reminder that the fight for Indigenous rights often involves pushing back against deeply entrenched power structures, challenging discriminatory policies, and demanding a more just and equitable society.
It's a fight for recognition, for respect, for the right to exist on one's own terms.
Absolutely. So where are we headed next on our journey?
Let's travel south to Burkina Faso, where the report highlights the violence and displacement faced by pastoralist communities, particularly the Pul and Tuareg.
Pastoralist communities, they often face unique challenges, don't they? Their livelihoods depend on mobility, on access to grazing lands, and they're often caught in the crossfire of conflicts, competing with other groups for resources, facing pressure from governments to settle down, to abandon their traditional ways of life.
And the report doesn't shy away from the human cost of these conflicts. It includes a specific account of an attack on a Pul village, a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract statistics, they're real people's lives being torn apart.
It's heartbreaking. And the report also mentions efforts to address this violence through community meetings and dialogue.
It's a reminder that peace building is a complex process, but it's essential to address the root causes of these conflicts, to build trust and understanding between different communities, and to find ways to coexist peacefully.
Okay, let's move on to Ethiopia, where the report discusses the challenges faced by pastoralist communities there as well, particularly in the context of drought, conflict, and lack of access to basic services.
These communities are on the front lines of climate change, aren't they? Their livelihoods are directly impacted by changes in rainfall patterns, land degradation, and loss of livestock.
And the report describes the government's villagization program, which aimed to resettle pastoralists into more permanent settlements, raising concerns about forced displacement and human rights violations.
It's a classic example of how development policies, even those intended to improve people's lives, can have unintended negative consequences if they don't respect indigenous ways of life, their land tenure systems, and their right to free, prior, and informed consent.
It's about recognizing that development needs to be tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of different communities, and that Indigenous peoples need to have a voice in shaping those policies.
Now let's travel to Kenya, where the report explains the provisions in their 2010 constitution that protect Indigenous rights.
Constitutions are important, but they're just pieces of paper, aren't they? What matters is how they're implemented, how they're translated into real change on the ground.
Exactly, and the report highlights some successful examples of community-led resistance against land grabbing by multinational companies in Kenya, demonstrating the power of collective action and the importance of supporting these communities in their struggle to defend their rights.
It's inspiring to see those victories, to see communities standing up to these powerful forces and saying no to exploitation, no to dispossession.
From Kenya, we travel south to Tanzania, where the report discusses the call for constitutional recognition of Indigenous land rights.
Land rights are so fundamental to Indigenous peoples, aren't they? It's about more than just ownership. It's about their cultural identity, their spiritual connection to the land, their very survival.
And the report highlights a really significant event, the granting of a collective land title to the Hadzabe hunter-gatherer community.
Wow, that's a major step forward. It recognizes their unique way of life, their dependence on the land for their cultural and physical well-being, and it sets a precedent for other communities to follow.
It's a reminder that there are different ways of relating to land, different ways of understanding ownership, and that we need to move beyond those Western models of individual property rights if we're going to truly respect Indigenous rights and knowledge.
Absolutely. Okay, where are we off to next?
Let's head to Rwanda, where the report describes the marginalization of the Badwa people.
The Batwa, they were evicted from their forest lands to make way for national parks, weren't they? Another example of how conservation efforts, when done wrong, can actually harm Indigenous communities.
Exactly. And the report explains their struggle for representation in governance structures and the challenges they face in accessing education and economic opportunities.
It's like they've been doubly marginalized, first by being evicted from their lands, and then by being excluded from the benefits of development.
It's a reminder that conservation needs to be approached in a holistic way, taking into account the rights and well-being of Indigenous communities, not just the protection of biodiversity.
And it's about ensuring that they have a voice in decision-making processes, that they're not just seen as obstacles to conservation, but as partners.
All right, let's travel to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country rich in resources but also plagued by conflict and poverty.
The Congo, that's a complex situation with a long history of exploitation and violence.
The report points out the lack of a law protecting Indigenous rights, but it also mentions the proposal for an Indigenous Peoples Act, which could be a step in the right direction.
Hopefully that proposal gained traction and led to some meaningful change. It's essential to have legal frameworks in place that recognize and protect Indigenous rights, but it's equally important to ensure that those laws are implemented effectively and that communities are empowered to exercise those rights.
The report also discusses the efforts to ensure Indigenous peoples' involvement in the REDD Plus process.
REDD plus ISA. That's the UN program for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, right?
Exactly. And it has the potential to benefit Indigenous communities who are often the best stewards of the forest. But there are also concerns about land grabbing and the potential for REDD Plus projects to further marginalize them if they're not designed and implemented in a participatory and equitable way.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it, between protecting forests and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples who depend on those forests for their livelihoods and cultural survival.
The report also mentions the creation of the National Indigenous Peoples Forum in the DRC, a platform for communities to come together to share their experiences, to advocate for their rights, and to engage in dialogue with the government.
That's a crucial step towards empowering Indigenous communities and ensuring that their voices are heard in decision-making processes.
Okay, let's move on to the Republic of Congo, just to the west of the DRC. The report highlights the significance of their law on the promotion and protection of the rights of Indigenous populations.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that law.
Well, it was a landmark achievement, the first of its kind in Africa, setting a precedent for other countries to follow.
It's a reminder that progress is possible, that even in contexts where Indigenous rights have been historically denied, there's always hope for change.
The report explains the high expectations for this law to address discrimination, to protect Indigenous lands and resources, and to promote their participation in decision-making processes.
Hopefully it lived up to those expectations. It's one thing to have laws on paper, but it's another to translate those laws into real change in people's lives.
Now let's travel to the Central African Republic, where the report describes the lack of legal recognition for Indigenous people's rights and the challenges they face in accessing basic services and participating in decision-making.
It's like they're invisible, their needs and their rights ignored by the government.
The report mentions efforts to raise awareness about ILO Convention 169, which could provide a framework for protecting their rights. But it's clear that there's a lot of work to be done in the Central African Republic to address these issues.
It's a reminder that the fight for Indigenous rights is often a long and difficult one, and that it requires persistent advocacy, education, and mobilization to bring about meaningful change.
Okay, our penultimate stop on this journey through the IWGIA report takes us to Namibia, where the report describes the government's land reform program and the resettlement of Hayam Sand communities on their ancestral lands.
Land reform can be a powerful tool for addressing historical injustices, for returning land to those who were dispossessed, for restoring a sense of justice and dignity.
But the report also points out the challenges of establishing sustainable livelihoods on these farms and the need for greater support in education and capacity building.
It's about more than just handing over land. It's about providing communities with the resources and the skills they need to thrive, to rebuild their lives, to create a future for themselves on their ancestral lands.
It's about investing in their success, not just giving them a piece of paper and wishing them luck.
Absolutely. Okay, last stop. Botswana.
Yes, Botswana, where the government, at the time of this report, didn't recognize the concept of Indigenous peoples.
Another example of that denial of identity, that attempt to erase their existence and justify the violation of their rights.
But the report highlights the significant population of San people in Botswana who face poverty, marginalization, and discrimination, despite their rich cultural heritage and their deep connection to their lands.
And it delves into the controversy surrounding the CKGR evictions, a stark reminder of the ongoing struggles over Indigenous land rights and the need for legal and policy reforms to protect their livelihoods and cultural survival.
It's a reminder that the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over, and that we need to continue to raise awareness, to challenge discriminatory policies, and to support Indigenous communities in their struggle for justice and self-determination.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about all the complexities and the interconnectedness of these issues. It's not just about land rights or cultural preservation. It's about human rights. It's about social justice. It's about environmental sustainability. It's about finding ways to live together on this planet in a way that respects the dignity and the rights of all.
Yeah, it does. It's been a heavy journey, honestly, going through all these cases, seeing the injustices, the struggles, the violence that Indigenous communities are facing all over the world.
I agree it can feel overwhelming at times, but I think it's important to remember that this report is just a snapshot in time and things are always evolving. The fight for Indigenous rights is ongoing, and there are victories happening all the time, stories of resilience and resistance that give us hope.
That's true. We've seen examples of communities successfully challenging those in power, blocking destructive projects, reclaiming their lands, revitalizing their cultures.
And those victories are important not just for the communities themselves, but for all of us. They show us that change is possible, that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, people can come together, they can organize, they can speak truth to power, and they can make a difference.
Absolutely. So what can our listeners do, if they're feeling inspired to take action to support Indigenous communities in their struggles?
Well, first and foremost, educate yourself. Learn about the issues, the history, the different communities and their struggles. There are so many resources available online, books, documentaries, podcasts.
And this report is a great starting point, even though it's from 2012.
Definitely. It provides this really comprehensive overview of the issues that are still relevant today. And once you've done your research, think about how you can get involved. There are so many ways to support Indigenous communities, whether it's through donating to organizations that are working on the front lines, volunteering your time, writing to your elected officials, or even just spreading awareness and talking to your friends and family about these issues.
And remember, supporting Indigenous rights is not just about charity. It's about justice.
It's about recognizing that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights, just like everyone else. Rights to their lands, their cultures, their self-determination.
It's about standing in solidarity with them, amplifying their voices, and working together to create a more just and equitable world for all.
A world where Indigenous knowledge and ways of life are valued and respected, where their contributions to society are acknowledged and celebrated.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Indigenous rights.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you to all our listeners for taking the time to learn and engage with these important issues.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world for all.